the things that the Catholic Church was doing was aligned with what the Bible said. And so he really wanted to create a sort of reform from within the Catholic Church, and he had no intention of creating his own church and denomination, and he would probably be appalled that people started calling themselves Lutherans. But it began as a sort of theological debate around grace, around being around salvation that is through God's grace and not works. And then it quickly became this sort of upheaval that was not just theological, but it was also political, it was cultural. The sort of bedrock of society started to crumble beneath folks, because that's how much of a hold the Catholic Church had on folks during the 16th century. So that was kind of the beginnings of things. In 1517 was the very beginning of Martin Luther talking about those things, and his 95 Theses was sort of the beginning. It's kind of the equivalent today would be writing a scathing blog post and sending it out to everyone. But he nailed it to the door of a church, and it was meant to initiate reform within the Catholic Church. In terms of the relationship between church and state, Martin Luther had a lot to say about a lot of things, and he has a lot of writings. But one of the sort of prominent things that he gifted the Protestant church, and especially the Lutheran tradition, is this doctrine of two kingdoms. And what that says is that God governs the world in two sort of distinct but interconnected ways. On the one hand, the right hand, as Martin Luther would say, there is the church. And the church governs the world in the spiritual realm. And so by administering the sacraments and by proclaiming the gospel, those are the ways that the church governs our society. And then on the left hand is the sort of other interconnected way that God is governing our world is through the state, or the civil realm. And that's about maintaining order and maintaining justice. And so those are, they are separate, but they are also a part of the same body. And they're also, according to Martin Luther, accountable to God. So when things begin to get corrupted on either side, they would be held accountable to God. And so a lot of people will kind of quote Romans 13 in terms of obeying civil authority, and I think that Martin Luther would do the same thing. He agrees that we should obey civil authority unless the civil authorities begin to become unjust or go against God's will. And so those are sort of the broad ideas around Martin Luther's theology of separation of church and state and the beginnings of that. And I think a lot of that came from his experience of the church and state, the Catholic Church, and the government of his time being so incredibly intertwined in a way that was not helpful, in a way that was corrupting both the church and the government. And he was trying to parse out a different way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it to Adam. No, the Lutherans were not the only ones involved in the Reformation. So I'm going to go to their cousin, the Reformed and Presbyterian. Adam, if you'll share.
Yeah, I often think that if Martin Luther was the guy that you wanted to have a beer with, John Calvin was the one who would just sort of look at you and be like, what are you guys doing? He is just like the most cranky guy. I don't think I would have enjoyed just like sitting and, hanging out with him. But he is an important figure in the Reformed tradition. And what I think is important, and you'll hear this throughout as I'm talking about what the Reformed tradition and the Presbyterian tradition offer in this scope, is it is so often that our sense of political theology is not just shaped by theology, but also our polity. And that is a really important thing for my Presbyterian friends and the folks that I'm on session with. This is something we talk about all the time. And if you don't know that word, in a lot of ways what I'm getting at is governmental structure, but in particular, covenantal structures that keep the church and the state, in a similar way to what Sarah said, accountable under the lordship of Jesus Christ. So there's three folks I want to talk about that help sort of frame this sense of the Reformed tradition in the Reformation. And of course, we'll start with John Calvin, who was a lawyer and a theologian. And a lot of what he was trying to get at was this idea that civil government was necessary and it was God ordained. Like, it was necessary and it had to be distinct from the church. Now, neither one of them was meant to be over the other. In a lot of ways, they're meant to be co-equal institutional partners, predominantly under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And right from the beginning in Geneva, what you begin to see is in Calvin's way of shaping how the governance of the church was supposed to be, that there was this idea of the consistory, which composed itself of ministers and elders. And what's unique about that, I think, is it created a distributed authority. It created a shared discipline, and it created mutual accountability. And that carries with us even today. As a pastor in a Presbyterian church, I am one of many that make decisions together as a session, right? And so I don't carry any more authority as the pastor, as an elder, as any of the other members of my session do. So we work together and make collaborative decisions. And so distributing the power over multiple people is a through line that you'll see throughout the course of Reformed theology. Calvin said in the Institutes, I won't make you read it or anything because it's long and it's exhausting, but he says, "It is a vain fear to suppose that civil government is opposed to religion. Its appointed end is to foster and protect the outward worship of God." So in Calvin's mind, the idea was government is supposed to be there to help ensure that there is freedom to practice religion, and that should be something that will come back again and again. So this is fundamentally at the beginning Calvin's move, which is instead of moving in other directions, and we'll hear about this, the Anabaptist tradition that said, well, we should sort of dismantle the structure, or at times to say we need to be within a state structure. What Calvin was getting at is to say they should be co-equal, and they should be institutions, and they need each other, and they should inform one another. You keep going now from Reformed to the Presbyterian, and John Knox, who is up in Scotland, and what he's going to begin to do is push this idea of resistance even further. And it's the idea that if rulers are going to suppress the gospel, then resistance has to be the duty and responsibility of the church. And Knox at the time, up in Scotland, which is where we as Presbyterians kind of claim our fundamental heritage is through the Church of Scotland, also has this popular elder-led, in Scotland, the idea of the kirk, which is the church. So again, there was this idea that should have institutional relevance as well within the civil realm. So it's not just the idea that the church ought to function with distributed power, but so should institutions on the civil side as well. And Knox said, if princes be tyrants against God's truth, they should be deposed by the lawful magistrates of the realm. So if you think about that, right, what Knox is starting to push one step further from Calvin is to say, if our institutional co-equal partner is acting like a tyrant and not supporting our ability to be in freedom, then it ought to be the responsibility of the lawful magistrates to depose that tyrant. So this becomes sort of the pivot that we start to see within the Reformed stream in the Reformation, that we should honor co-equal natures of the church and state, but when that covenant is broken, again, that covenant that is under the lordship of Jesus Christ, we don't just have permission, but at sometimes the obligation to resist the civil authorities. And this becomes then what I think is a distinctive in the Reformed tradition of our political theology, and it is through our polity. Because we're structuring mutuality and then we work through it. Now this, at the end of the day, I realize, and this is something I'll talk about later if we talk about, well, what are the blind spots, is that is not a really good soundbite thing. Like, Presbyterian polity is not the sexy thing that you're like, well, why do I go to a Presbyterian church? Because I love the governance, right? But what it does end up working towards, I think, is a different type of stability and mooring. So it's not just fighting the man for the sake of fighting the man, but it's saying what structures can we create that will lead to longer lasting stability, both for the church and for the state. Now, if we go a little later, there's one more person that's worth mentioning. In the mid-1600s, you have a guy by the name of Samuel Rutherford who wrote a book called Lex Rex, and he is a Scottish Presbyterian minister. And what he does is now he pushes this one step further to say law and covenant, again, this sort of sense that Calvin had, is above the king. And so authority is trust. So if God has given this authority, it is held in trust in covenant. And that breach of that, if the state moves in to be a tyrant, then it actually delegitimizes that authority of the king. And what this will begin to do, just a century later, we'll see, is start to open the door to constitutional limits. What is the limit of power? What is the limit? What defines somebody doing the job of the civil magistrate and passes it on to the tyrant? Well, now we start to see that if the civil authority is not honoring the covenantal bounds, then something's wrong. And so this is when this idea of resistance that Calvin and then Knox is getting to actually now starts to shape constitutional thinking. That we have limits of authority, we have limits of power, we have checks and balances, that it's governed by covenant, not by decree. And so I think these three figures start to shape then where we're going to head in the long run. But at least as you start to hear all of us together, the distinctive here for the reformed line of this is really to say covenantal, co-equal, and governance. Those, I think, are the three main points that these three folks were really starting to bring forward that I think then become a gift to the revolution and where we are today.
Thank you, Adam. Am I punting it to the Baptist or to the Episcopal?
I'll go.
Okay.
It's loud. So the relationship between the church and the state, according to the earliest Anabaptists, was typically along the edge of a sword. There's an old line that Catholics and Protestants could agree with on vanishingly little during the Reformation, but one of the things that they were absolutely certain on was that it was a very good thing to kill a Baptist. The word Baptist obviously is derived from Anabaptist, which was a slur. It was not taken up by them, it was given to them, because it means originally second baptism or baptism again, because they were known as people who were baptized a second time. A better term for the early, what came to be Baptist movement, would be the Radical Reformation. Because where these other traditions started from the church as it was and wanted to tweak things here and there, the earliest people who came to be known as Baptists wanted to go back to the root of Christianity, which is what radical means. It doesn't always mean crazy, although certainly it can mean crazy, and in our story it does mean crazy from time to time. But the root of the word radical is the word radix, which is where we get the word radish, the vegetable, which is itself root. And so what they did is, instead of starting with the church as it existed in Europe and wanting to make adjustments here and there, they said, no, we are going back to the New Testament. We are going back to the earliest example of the apostles, as they saw it, the purest form of Christianity there was, and we are going to model our lives on those people, which is why they came to be known as Anabaptists, because when they went back to the New Testament, what they saw there was baptism upon profession of faith. All of them, because they'd grown up in Catholic Europe, had been baptized as infants. And so in that first generation, they said, that's not a real baptism. So they were baptized anew. Their opponents would say a second time, but they would say anew, into this church. That was a threat, right? Because by claiming that, they were threatening the establishment of the church and therefore the establishment of the government wherever they were. This all started in Zurich, Switzerland, moved around the sort of Swiss cantons into Germany and then through Europe. But everywhere they went, they were seen as a threat because they did not believe in the church as it was established, fused with the state. And also because they then did not believe in the authority of the local government over their lives, and especially their religious lives, which didn't just exist in their mind or their heart as faith, but existed in their hands and their feet in how they lived their lives. And so they were very often outside of the structures. They were pushed out of cities. They were killed on sight. A lot of them beheaded, some of them burned at the stake. A number of them, ironically and intentionally cruelly, were drowned. If they wanted to be so wet, the authorities said, then let them do so. So that's how the first generation of Baptists related to the state. They related to the state in the same way that they saw Christians relate to the state in the New Testament, as a persecuted minority that did not align with the civil authority, that did not themselves pick up a sword either in self-defense or in military service, following the example of their Lord Jesus and the earliest disciples.
Thank you. Well, now we're going to move off the continent into a little bit north with the Episcopals. Lisa, I'll let you take it from here and a little bit about your tradition's development during the Reformation and political power.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. I just want to start for a minute by kind of orienting my tradition. So I am ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church. I highlight that I'm ordained as a priest because that is one thing that separates me a little bit from the other folks on the stage. The Episcopal Church is the American branch of what is called the Anglican Communion. The Anglican Communion is a global church of 80 million people that has its origins in the Church of England. So as the British Empire expanded, so did Anglicanism, and that's how Anglicanism came to the States. But we, all throughout the Anglican Communion, our origins are in the Church of England. I see it as part of the vocation of Anglicans to be a little blurry theologically. Our job is to kind of say, okay, you have these nice clear lines, we're going to mess them up a little bit. And so I'm going to do that. We're kind of known for having our start with Henry VIII in the 16th century. He wanted a divorce and broke with Rome, and that's kind of the origin story that gets told most frequently. I don't really see that being the start of the Church of England, and kind of most clergy I know don't. The church in England started when Pope Gregory the Great commissioned St. Augustine of Canterbury to go to Britain to Christianize the king. And that happened in 597. So we tend to think the church in England started then. And it really grew up as part of the Catholic Church, though England is pretty far from Rome. And so it did have its own characteristics. The Catholic Church is known for the Roman rite, but that wasn't always how the whole Catholic Church celebrated Mass. The British Isles had their own rite called the Sarum Rite that had more Celtic influence, more Byzantine influence. And so I raise that just to say, Henry VIII didn't really do what he did to start a new church. Ours was more a political question than a theological one, at least at that moment in time. It wasn't about creating a new church, it was about who was going to control the one that existed. And so, we're talking about church-state relations. At this moment in time, the king became the head of our church. So it was an established church. That being said, the next century after that, so it did create kind of a political problem. Are we aligned with Rome or not, and to what extent? And so the next century in England, there was an awful lot of fighting. We swung back and forth between really reformed moments and then much more Catholic moments. There were wars fought, people died. I mean, it was a very big political struggle. There was an English Civil War in about 100 years later. There was an attempt to settle it through the Elizabethan settlement. It was the beginning of Anglicanism starting to think about itself as what was called the Via Media, or the middle way, the third way, between Anglicanism, or between Catholicism and Reformed traditions, between high church and low church. But it didn't really stick during the Elizabethan settlement. Later we had the English Civil War. And it really wasn't until 1660 that at one point the monarchy was abolished and so was the episcopacy. In 1660, the monarchy was brought back, the episcopacy was brought back, and in 1662 we have what's called the Book of Common Prayer. If you're Episcopalian in the room, this is very familiar. This is what we base our worship on every Sunday. 1662 was the kind of core prayer book for the Church of England, and it really combined Catholic and Reformed thought. For instance, that would be called an altar in the Catholic Church. It would be called a table in the Baptist Church. So if you're trying to create a prayer book, what do you call that piece of furniture right there if you're trying to blend traditions? Well, we just do both. We call it a table in some places, and we call it an altar in some places. And, one criticism of our tradition is that we could be theologically messy. We're not consistent. And that may be true, but what is happening is actually we're really trying to hold really different viewpoints together. And so rather than prioritizing doctrine, we prioritize worship. So if you can pray these prayers that are in our prayer book, you're one of us. We say that the family that prays together stays together is kind of the idea. So, a big criticism is that we're based in theological fudge. But the doctrine is there. It's just we prioritize worship. And, we'll get more to the king and our relationship with the king, I think, in the next question. But I just wanted to situate my tradition there. We don't really see the Reformation as a breaking point. We really started, around 600, and for the next 1,000 years developed into this tradition with a prayer book at the center.
So all of you tonight are going to leave with a new history major, a new history degree after this incredible information. I just want to remind you the note cards in your pews, if you have questions and want to pass them to the end. These folks over here, if you want to ask your neighbors in the pews, or if you have questions, we're going to move to the second question, but just raise your note card if you would like for someone to pick it up. So now we're going to skip on a bunch of history. If you want to flip your timeline over, you will see that dates around the Revolution are on the backside. This is a question if it's okay, going to go back to Elise again, to talk about your tradition and how it influenced the American Revolution in particular, or maybe it did not. There were lots of differences as we talked. And then also how some of you may be able to speak to that led to the development of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, with a focus on the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Some of our traditions were heavily involved in the Revolution, some were not, and they're going to highlight that and speak to that. But now that they've kind of grounded you in this history from the Reformation, I'm going to give them a chance to speak to directly the American Revolution. Elise, you ready to, Reverend?
Just these little topics, you know. So as I said, you know, as the British Empire expanded, the Anglicanism kind of went throughout the world, including to the American colonies. So prior to the Revolution, Anglicanism was here. You know, we identify so strongly with the separation of church and state that we maybe sometimes forget about some pre-revolution history. Anglicanism was the established church in several colonies prior to the Revolution. When I say established, I mean the official state religion. It was the religion of Virginia. It was the religion, actually, of New York for a period of time, Maryland, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. I think it was 8 different colonies. And so, you know, as the colonies had increasing desire for independence, it was a very difficult time for folks who were Anglican, especially clergy. Clergy were Anglican clergy, and still to now, Church of England, like current Church of England clergy, are required to pray for the king. They are required to obey the king. It is part of their ordination vows. And so, you know, even though folks here wanted independence, they felt bound by those vows, and it was difficult. I think if you just thought about it for a second, you might it'd be easy to assume Anglicans in the southern colonies would be more likely to be loyalists, and Anglicans in the northern colonies would be more likely to not be loyalists, and actually it was exactly the opposite. 80% of Northern Anglicans were loyalists, but only 20% of Southern Anglicans were loyalists. And that's because Anglicanism was much more established here. They were much more self-supporting. And so they didn't have to rely on the mother church and wanted that separation. Whereas Anglicanism in the north there was more Congregationalist influence. They were much more dependent on the crown for funding. So very, very difficult time. And yet, 34 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglican. 11 of our presidents have been Episcopalian. And that's really when we stopped calling ourselves Anglican and started calling ourselves Episcopalian. So it was at the Revolutionary War where, you know, we changed our name. We're still in communion with the See of Canterbury. We're still part of the Anglican Communion. But this branch in the United States, we are now Episcopalians. We took out the prayers for the king and replaced them with prayers for the president. We also set up a structure that was much more democratic. So Episcopal means bishop. Bishops are the unifying force of our denomination. In England, bishops are appointed by the king. Here, we elect our bishops. And from the beginning, it's not just clergy that elect bishops, lay people have a voice as well, because we wanted that democratic institution. So what I like about our tradition, it's a mess. It's really difficult. It's expensive. It's unwieldy. But what I like about it is that we have found a way to keep that long-running thread of apostolic succession. So our bishops can be traced back to the first apostles through the laying on of hands. I was ordained by a bishop that's in apostolic succession. That means something to me in a world that feels like it's lost at sea. That means something to me. But we've done it in a way that allows for a democratic voice to exist as well. Our presiding bishop was we don't have archbishops. That's one different. We also, so there's bishops, there's archbishops. You know, the Catholic Church has a pope. American colonists were very nervous about archbishops. We just thought that was too close to Rome and too close to the crown. So we don't have that. We just have a presiding bishop who's considered first among equals. So, if you imagine a hierarchy like a triangle, we have that. We just like lopped the top off. I'm pretty sure I had a point, but I think I lost it. One little thing that's just kind of fun. So we had a lot of problems in the beginning of the Episcopal Church with having enough clergy. So priests are ordained by bishops. It takes 3 bishops to make another bishop. We didn't have any of those. So we had to kind of keep going back to England to get priests, which is just a big problem. And then when we had the Revolution, our priests became American citizens and no longer swore allegiance to the king. And so they wouldn't consecrate bishops for us because we couldn't swear allegiance to the king anymore. So we snuck around them, and we went up to Scotland, where this really beleaguered Scottish Episcopal Church managed to survive amongst the John Knox adherents. And this tiny, scrappy little Scottish Episcopal Church, they had bishops, and so they made us a bishop. And our first bishop was Samuel Seabury, who served here and was a big foil to Alexander Hamilton. I have so many more notes, but I feel like I've been talking for a while, so I think maybe I'll work it in the Q&A.
I'm going to throw us a curveball and pass it back to Sarah. Tell us what the Lutherans were doing during this time of the time of the Revolution.
The Lutherans had a lot less feelings, just in general. It might be a German thing. I don't know. But I had to do a little bit of research because my Lutheranism in North America did not cover a whole lot about the history of the Revolution, and I think a part of that was because our Lutheran immigrants that were mostly in Pennsylvania at the time, they came over from Germany and Sweden, and they were really used to this like church and state intertwined, like very together sort of understanding. And then they moved to Pennsylvania, and they all of a sudden had neighbors who were Quakers and who were Baptist and who were Anglicans, and they thought, oh, we have to learn how to get along with people who have different religious leanings than we do. And instead of disliking that, they kind of figured out that, oh, this is kind of nice. We kind of like the religious tolerance and the religious understanding that is happening here. And so when folks started talking about independence and started talking about this idea that there would be more religious liberty, the German and the Swedish Lutherans said, well, yeah, of course, I want my Quaker neighbors and my Baptist neighbors to continue to be able to worship the way that they're worshiping, and we want to be able to continue to worship the way that we're worshiping. There is a little bit of lore and history around kind of this idea that Lutherans really like stability, and I think that is also probably a little bit of a German thing. And so, for instance, in the Peasants' Revolt that happened, Martin Luther kind of famously sided with the princes and not the peasants. And I think that has to do a little bit with stability, but also maybe to do with the fact that there were princes who were bankrolling the things that he was writing about, and they were hiding him from the Pope and the Catholic Church. And so he had a really good incentive to side with the princes, whether or not that makes it right. But I think that in the Revolution, there was a little bit of leaning within the church, especially with the pastors, to want that stability as well and to not want to disrupt things. And so Henry Muhlenberg is kind of known as the patriarch of the American Lutherans. And he was trying really hard to kind of keep all of the Lutheran churches kind of calm and like, don't say too much, like just keep worshiping and like keep preaching the gospel and administering the sacraments. Like, we're just gonna kind of ride this through. And he had two sons. And his two sons were very young and very energetic towards the cause. And Peter, his one son, famously was a pastor in a Lutheran church. And after he preached his sermon, he tore off his clericals and had a Continental Army uniform underneath and said that he was going to fight. And so his father was not successful in telling them that they should kind of just stay out of the fight. And then his other son, Frederick Muhlenberg, was the first Speaker of the House of the U.S. Representatives, and he signed the Bill of Rights. And so with both sons, Henry Muhlenberg was just not very successful. And I don't know if there are any parents who really understand that, but he was not successful in keeping his sons kind of under his wing and keeping them where he thought that the church should stay in a conflict like that. And I would say, like, in terms of the Bill of Rights, and especially the First Amendment, the key factor with Lutheranism and the Lutheran doctrine around the separation of church and state is that it's not a separation in order to disengage or even to separate in some way that is going to create a wall, but it's really to protect the church's mission so that the state does not co-opt the church's mission in some way. And it also protects the people's conscience. And so it keeps the church from standing up on a Sunday morning and telling the people how they should view the state and the governance, and so and have it determine their salvation. And so that is kind of the Lutheran view in terms of the First Amendment and that sort of separation, and why most Lutherans were really in favor of that, because they felt very strongly that there should be a separation so that both parties can do their jobs.
To you, Adam, if you want to take up this next question about how the Presbyterians or the Reform movement involved in the Revolution.
Yeah. So one thing that's helpful to know is, as Presbyterians, and really any flavor of Presbyterian in this country, of which there's like 70 million of them, we all tend to structure the same way, is that our foundational guide is Scripture. That is the fundamental. Then we will look to two other sources as helpful lenses in how we are able to think about Scripture. One is our Book of Confessions, and so these are creedal statements that we say are not raised to the level of Scripture, but they're helpful to see throughout the course of history, but also connecting us from, the very earliest creeds to today, how we are interpreting Scripture, how we have interpreted Scripture. And of course, we have our Book of Order, which again, when I've talked about structure and polity, like that's the other side. And it is a book that helps us understand how we do things. And so one of those creedal statements is the Westminster Confession. And I want to do a quote in that to help frame this transitional point between Reformation and the Revolution. So this is from chapter 23. This was written in 1646. It then gets revised in 1788 by the American Church at that point. And this is what it says. It civil authorities may not take on themselves the ministering of God's word and the sacraments, the administration of spiritual power, or any interference with matters of faith. 1646. Nevertheless, it is the duty of civil authorities to protect the Church of our Lord without giving any preference to any denomination of Christians, so that every person with church affiliations or duties will be able to function with complete and unquestioned freedom. And then it ends with this. It is the duty of civil authorities to protect the person and good name of everyone, so that none are abused, injured, or insulted on account of religious faith or lack of it. Now, think about that. This is written in 1646. Religious freedom, the responsibility of the civil authorities to provide for the protection of free exercise of religion, but also the free exercise of a lack of religion. So this is a foundational creedal statement that is even before the Revolution, that as Presbyterians we are holding as a value. And so when we start to think about the Revolution, and I think, I had told everybody that, to be honest, this is not something, I too didn't have a lot of sort of study into this, so prepping for this talk, it's really given me a chance to appreciate things. And I think, again, I talked about structure and polity being a Presbyterian through line, even when we resist and even when we say that something should be better, we don't abandon the structure. Fundamentally, that's the Presbyterian way. And so when you hear things like that that are built into the way that we understand Scripture and we understand the way we as humanity are understanding God, it starts to make sense that these ideas of federal structure and shared and diffuse power and covenant are in the water for a century before the Revolution. So, and here's the thing, Presbyterians were all over the board when it came to support of the Revolution. There were some that were for it, some that were against it. That also sounds like a good session meeting most of the time, But there is a reason in part why those who were on the other side of the ocean in part called the Revolution the Presbyterian Rebellion. Because some of the structures that end up getting incorporated. Because one of the things that we do and what we have from the outset is we layer our church authority. Where we are not that Episcopal structure, nor are we Congregationalists, that everything kind of happens on the congregational level. We have this sort of hybrid Presbyterian structure where we have a session and then a makeup of the session. Representatives of those sessions now are on a presbytery level, and then representatives from presbytery are part of a synod, and then representatives from a synod then go on to the General Assembly. It all filters up so that fundamentally federal representation of General Assembly comes from representatives from the sessions and from the local level, and that's how we make decisions together as a body. When we get together every other year in General Assembly, the issues that come before us actually come from churches and are supported by presbyteries and then are ratified and then are voted on at General Assembly. And so this helps prepare us for these ideas of constitutional checks. How do we pass laws? Well, we pass them ideally, and we can talk about how maybe this is not quite the way it is now. We do it through understanding the local level, and we try to represent that well. What's interesting is we don't have as many signers of the Constitution as the Episcopals do. We have 16, but I will say the one thing we have is we have the only clergy person, and that's John Witherspoon, who signed the Constitution. He was a Presbyterian minister, president of Princeton, and one of the signers of the Declaration. There's also a little bit of whether he directly taught Madison or whether just by being in the same air there was some influence. But he really brought that sort of Scottish moral philosophy with this idea of this Reformed covenantalism. And one of the things that he said was there is not a single instance in history in which civil liberty was lost and religious liberty preserved entire. So even there we start to see that civic freedom and religious freedom are always by nature entwined, and as one goes, so goes the other. And I do think that even if we're looking at the revolution and we're looking at the structures that then help to become the federalist structures that are created today, right, they have some roots in sort of Presbyterian polity. But if we lose ordered liberty, we lose the freedom to worship in covenant. And if you think about those words in the Westminster Confession that argued that there was no tradition or lack of tradition that should be preferenced, there is a reason why the hairs on my neck start to come up in our current discourse today. Because it's not just today that that has mattered. One of the gifts of preparing for this is to realize that this has been centuries of shouting this from the rooftops from the Reformed tradition that's saying, maybe we ought to make sure that everybody is free. And as it pertains to disestablishment, what I think is interesting is as Presbyterians, we were already trying to figure out the self-governance thing. We saw ourselves, again, as co-equal branches of how life should function within a municipality. So we didn't necessarily need the state to enforce discipline or doctrine. We just wanted to be left alone and do our job, right? We have our own sort of disciplinary structure. We have our own way of engaging what discipline, if somebody violates our laws, how we manage it. Covenant, at the end of the day, throughout the Reformed tradition, the idea is to protect that autonomy. So what it ultimately does, and this is not to disparage the idea of an Episcopal way of doing things at all, but this idea was it prevents the state from having the allure of ultimately having control and operating as an Episcopal oversight or a bishop oversight to what the church is doing. What's interesting is the confession, Westminster Confession, did get updated in 1788 for an American revision and said, God alone is Lord of the conscience. Right? So it's not the civil magistrates, it's only God alone. And that the civil magistrate may not assume to himself the administration of the word and sacrament. In other words, your representative ain't preaching you the gospel, ain't giving you the sacraments in order to order your life. That is wholly the responsibility of the church. And so what I think is interesting, and I'm sure BJ will get to this, is that I think the Baptist tradition at the time really wanted to enshrine this idea of the liberty of conscience. But the Presbyterians, I think, could join in that without losing the public witness of it. So what I think is really interesting is that, and I think you'll hear in one thing, and it's so great to hear everybody, is that we all have these unique gifts that we can offer to help create what I think we're all hoping for as a shared across the board. What I think happened is again, I think the urgency and really the existential side of the Baptist tradition that comes here in this country, it ultimately ends up securing the space for the disestablishment. But I think the gift of the Presbyterian tradition and the Reformed tradition throughout all of this is that we could provide the structure, because we had been using that structure for centuries before that, and then at the time that it mattered, we could end up being able to create something that could enshrine that disestablishment, could set up a diffuse order of freedom and power and allow these things to flourish so long as they're preserved and so long as we pay attention to the stewardship of those things, both on the church side but on the state side as well. So I think that's a really interesting way that we have sort of been able to say, again, polity, not the most dramatic thing, not the thing that gets the sound bites, but at the end of the day, the structure helps us stay stable.
Thank you. You do love your church government. Thank you.
Well, I am Presbyterian.
So passing it to the real rebels, Baptists, do you want to take up the lead on the revolution?
So I'm grateful for Adam cheating and going back to the 17th century, because I need to do the same thing to kind of tell our story. And that is because there are two Baptists that I think most people in America have a realistic chance of recognizing their names. The first is a guy named Jimmy Carter. The second is a guy named Roger Williams. Roger Williams was a 17th century clergyman in Massachusetts who became convinced of the truth of the Baptist message. He began preaching freedom of conscience and soul liberty in Massachusetts, and that got him in trouble. And after he was punished, he did it again, and that got him in trouble. And after he was punished, he did it again, and that got him banished from Massachusetts colony. This was January, right? If you've ever been to Boston in January, you know the weather's not great. So this middle-aged guy is sent out into the wilderness, and he is rescued by the local Native American tribe, which is very Christian of them to take him in the middle of winter. And he ends up establishing a place called Providence Plantation, which was the first place in the Western Hemisphere where religious freedom was enshrined. Providence Plantation became a town called Providence, which became the capital of a colony called Rhode Island. And that is where one of our 13 colonies came from. Roger Williams was a foundational person, not just in the history of the Baptist Church in America, but America itself. He did not just preach religious liberty and dignity of all people for Christians. He preached it for literally all people, including those same Native Americans. He would talk to the governance in Massachusetts about how the Native Americans around them were people just like them, made in the image of God just like them, and deserved that kind of respect. When he established Providence Plantation, he paid for the land instead of just taking it. He insisted on paying fairly because he saw them as full people with full dignity as created in God's image, even though they would have been, by the lights of the time, heathens. The second Baptist that I think is worth bringing up here is a guy named John Leland. Y'all almost certainly will have never heard of him unless you were born in Virginia. Leland was a Baptist pastor in a place called Orange County. Grew up during the Revolutionary era, during the colonial era. Was a Baptist in a state, in a colony that had an established church that was not Baptist, that was Church of England. And so he, just like a lot of other people when this new country was being founded, advocated for more religious tolerance and religious freedom. And it was in the scales, right? Like, one of the things that we need to talk about here is that the colonies, a lot of them did have established churches. But during this revolutionary time, more and more people realized, no, we need to be able to worship freely. We do not need either government compulsion, government coercion, or overt government licensing of individuals' religions. So if you know your history, then you know that the revolution starts, the colonies come together, and they form a loosely affiliation confederation under the Articles of Confederation. And they limp along with that for about a decade until they realize they need something better, which is where we got the Constitution. But for the Constitution to be enacted, 9 of the 13 colonies had to accept it as law, okay? 8 of them had. Rhode Island, by the way, refused to. They almost had to put a trade embargo. The other colonies, states at that time, almost had to put a trade embargo on Rhode Island to make them submit. As I said, sometimes Baptists can mean crazy. But Virginia was on a knife's edge. Would the Virginia legislature approve this new constitution, or would they not? And it could have gone either way. On one side, you had a guy named Patrick Henry who thought this was a bad idea. On another side, you had a guy named James Madison who thought it was a good idea. But to get it passed, he knew he needed more common support. So he went to a guy named John Leland. He went to Leland's house, and they spent half a day together. And he promised Leland that after the Constitution was ratified, it would immediately be amended so that personal freedoms would be protected under this new body of governance. And first amongst those would be religious freedom for Baptists like him, right, who for 200 years at this point had suffered persecution at the hands of almost everybody, whether it's violent persecution during the Reformation or just mild persecution by being disestablished and having to fight against established religion in the colonies. But not just for them, but for literally everybody else. If you're a Quaker, if you're Jewish, if you're that Native American, right, that Roger Williams gets to know. So Leland gets these promises from Madison, and he goes to the legislature and convinces them that we need to ratify the Constitution. Virginia does. They become that ninth state to ratify it. The Constitution is then enacted, and then Madison fulfills fulfills this promise with the Bill of Rights, and certainly since we're talking about religious freedom today, the First Amendment. So that's how two Baptists in particular played a pivotal role in the history of religious freedom in America and in establishing the civil culture, both secular and religious, that we still benefit from today.
Move to the final question. You have note cards. If you have questions that you want to ask, please raise your hand. We have some folks who are going to collect them. Just pass them to the end. I'm gonna start out with you, BJ, because I know there's a quote that you want to share that we keep talking about. But always history informs the present, and there's more to these traditions. We haven't even touched on the history of the African American church and the results of slavery and how that engagement came into the political sphere. But for these traditions, history always informs the present, and I want to be able to give you a chance to talk about current engagement in church-state separation issues.
Yeah, so the quote that Rebecca's referencing, I do not know who said it. If y'all know who said it, please somebody raise your hand and tell me, because it's a pretty good one, and I'm probably going to mangle it. But I'm pretty sure it was a Baptist who said at some point, when the church and the state get in bed together, the church gets pregnant, and what issues forth doesn't look anything like Jesus. That's a pretty good line. And I think it's true, and I think we as Baptists, quite frankly, know that because there was this one event where a group of Anabaptists in Germany took over the city of Munster and just made an absolute disaster of it. Did everything from abolishing personal property to enacting polygamy, so that a combined Catholic and Lutheran army stopped fighting one another to come and sack the city of Munster and get these yahoos out of power. So we've seen this go badly in our past. But we've seen it go badly in other ways as well. One of the things that is simply true is that we live in a fallen world. We live in a fallen world, right? Like this is Paul in Scripture, right? We see through a mirror dimly, right? We do not see perfectly. We see imperfectly. One day we will see perfectly, but now it is imperfect, which means lots of things, but one of those things is this: there is no pure form of Christianity on earth. There's absolutely no pure form of Christianity. And so if you establish any form of Christianity, you are not establishing Christianity as such. You are establishing some version of it, which inevitably will lead to the persecution of some other version of it. That's just how a fallen world is going to work. And that's something that we, as Baptists, know, and we've found it out over the last 500 years at almost every single step, whether that was in Germany, whether that was in Switzerland, quite frankly, whether that was in England, or whether you're Roger Williams getting kicked out in the cold by the Massachusetts Bay Colony because you wouldn't toe that particular line of faith. So to enshrine a religion is not to enshrine that religion in whole, it is only to enshrine that religion in part, which means that the rest of that religion is going to end up getting the short end of the stick.
Yeah. The Episcopal Church is not a large denomination. We're like 1.6 million in the Episcopal Church. We're part of the Anglican Communion, which is larger. But even though we're not that big, just because of the quirks of history, we have a kind of proximity to power that at times has been really bad for us and at times maybe provides an opportunity. History is a long time, and so sometimes we're going to embrace power and sometimes we're going to push against it. And I think, maybe the last 100 years we've embraced it, and I think maybe that pendulum is starting to shift. And I think just one example to raise, in January, President Carter passed away, good, faithful Georgia Baptist. And there were a ton of services in Georgia. But then they made their way up to Washington National Cathedral for this state funeral. And I think there's a lot of confusion around what Washington National Cathedral is. That is not funded by taxpayers. That is not a government church. It was chartered by Congress in the 1800s, but it is an Episcopal cathedral. It is run by the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. It is the see of the Bishop of Washington. And it is just because of history that not all presidential funerals happen there, but most do. And so it was our presiding bishop that was presiding over that funeral. And it was the Bishop of Washington, Mary Ann Buddy, who preached the sermon. I don't know if all of you noticed, it did become quite a news event, her sermon. I really don't think she was expecting that. But the current president and the current vice president were in attendance, and she made a plea for mercy on behalf of immigrants and on behalf of LGBT youth in particular, but really on behalf of all vulnerable people in this country. And the reaction was all through the range of reaction. There were some people were really celebrating those comments. Some people were really angry and saying you shouldn't bring partisan politics into the pulpit. And I don't know what was partisan about what she said. It was political, but it was the same sermon Mary Ann Buddy has been preaching her entire career from that pulpit as the Bishop of Washington. And it's the same sermon clergy have been preaching for centuries. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, blessed are the merciful. The politics of Jesus has not changed. To the extent that it sounds radical now, it's because we have changed. And so from my perspective, I don't know how to deal with what's going on, but I am taking comfort in finding some rootedness or some groundedness in history. That the prayers we prayed in 1662 that united the Church of England are very similar to the prayers we're praying now. When the big bill was passed, I hesitate to call it beautiful, clergy around my denomination were quoting prayers from their prayer book saying, "Let not the needy, O Lord, be forgotten, nor the hope of the poor be taken away." This isn't new, this isn't radical, this is centuries of tradition that is grounded in the politics of Jesus. And so I think I'll just leave it at that. But I really appreciate this conversation, and I really appreciate being here, and I'll kick it back.
So one of my favorite theologians, because I did public policy for years, is a guy by the name of Abraham Kuyper, a Dutch Reformed pastor, becomes prime minister. He goes to Princeton. He does a series of lectures on Calvinism. One of the things he says, it has been really mine, that there is not a single square inch of this world that is not under the lordship and under the covenant of Jesus Christ. That, to me, means that there is a calling to speak into everything. It also means, in the sense of covenant, and that the church and the civil magistrates are, in essence, co-equals. It also means that we act as loyal opposition. It also means that my primary allegiance is not to my co-equal. It is to who my covenant is with, and it is to God first. If that's true, then that means I have a right to be the loyal opposition and speak to my partner and to say, hey, I don't think this is the way you ought to do it. And I think that's really important. This summer, my son, 5th grade going into 6th, so we did what is the expected thing that all 5th graders in Hendricks Avenue Elementary do, and we went to Washington, D.C. We, on Monday, got to take a tour of the Capitol building. And I found myself finding a deeper sense of patriotism. Because I saw, again, you joke, but like I am Presbyterian because of this polity. It's not because I can get Reformed theology a lot of places, but I love the way we think about how to operate in the world. And I saw at its best what it can be. These gorgeous cathedrals, that we could have an opportunity to do good work together. And as we're exiting, we're of course trying to herd all these cats together to take a picture. And over off to the side, there's a group of people coming together. And of course, some of my other parents are looking like, oh, I don't know who these group of people are. They're looking ready to protest. And I see some of them have stoles on, so I'm like, oh, these are my people. And so I was like, I'll go ahead and I'll go talk to the clergy. Well, it turns out that this is, it was a Moral Monday action. And Moral Monday, it's folks who get together, clergy, folks, and they protested. At that time, they were protesting the large bill that was going forward and how it was going to have cuts to Medicaid and everything. And what one of the other clergy told me is as we were talking, William Barber was on his way to the Capitol Rotunda to pray for our country, to pray that we do exactly what Elise had talked about, that we continue to preach that message. And they said, in all likelihood, he's going to be arrested. And of course, my son, being inquisitive, asked, well, what's going on, Dad? And so I told him, and I said, and this is why I love this country, is that we, as faithful people, can continue to have a right and a responsibility and a covenantal obligation to proclaim the gospel in every hall, not as fearful of what the state may do, but that we are covenantal partners in coming up with something better. And at that moment, I probably felt more pride as an American because I was watching it in action. And so all of the stuff that we talked about, like at the end of the day, modern engagement is that. Is what does it mean to continue to proclaim the gospel, to restore sight to the blind, to release the prisoner. And we do it in all sorts of different ways, but we're all heading towards that direction. And if we are truly living into our historical roots, I believe we have to continue to do that. If we don't, then I don't know what we should expect after that.
Sarah, I want to give you a chance if you want to speak about the current context and kind of how history informs the present.
Sure. I will say that, admittedly, Lutherans have not always been on the right side of history. They have enjoyed being aligned with power throughout history and being aligned with the majority, depending on Lutherans can't claim him. I'm pretty sure he really didn't like Lutherans very much, but Karl Barth was a Swedish Reformed theologian, and he would say that we are to preach with the Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other, and that those two pieces of literature inform one another, and that if we're not engaged with the world, then we have no business preaching the gospel and understanding what God would be doing in the world and how God is breaking into the world now. And so I think that being separated in terms of the legal mumbo jumbo of separation of church and state does not mean that we are disengaged. It means that we are two hands of one body.
Thank you all. I want to get to some of these questions that were asked. These two are very similar, but do you think the founders intended freedom of religion or freedom from religion?
Yes.
These are a little similar. Another one was, how has the influence of church and religion been separated from the founding of our country? It sounds like religious freedom was enshrined because of religion and respect of it rather than spite of it. So did our founders intend freedom of religion or freedom from religion?
Yeah, I'd agree with BJ. I mean, even if again, you go back to that Westminster Confession, right? I mean, it was really shocking to me to reread it again and to see even then that it's not just to protect folks who are practicing, but also those who aren't. So this is not a novel idea that it is a both and. Because I always think there is this creeping suspicion, I think in all of our traditions, of like, when does power start to become tyranny? And I think the moment that you start creeping into saying, well, we need everybody to be religious, now we're starting to creep into who is, what the sovereign, to use kind of political theology terms, like who is in and who's out. And so the best thing seems to be and we're just here to let y'all make sure that you can exercise, but if you also choose not to, that's okay too.
So I'm reminded of a story from a saint in the life of my and Rebecca's youth, a man named Talmadge Skinner, who was the chaplain at Wofford College where we went, which is a Methodist school in South Carolina. And because Reverend Skinner grew up in South Carolina, he inevitably had cousins who were Baptists. And when they were kids, they would tell him, you realize you're going to hell because you were baptized as a baby, to which his reply was, the hell you say. And that's both freedom of religion and from religion in one anecdote. It is freedom for him and freedom for him from his Baptist cousins. So yes, I think these are two sides of the same coin.
So I was expecting this. There's questions about Jefferson and deism in the conversation. So this one, in the formation of the United States, Anglicanism was the established church, and many patriots so identified, yet much of the description of the so-called founders were reported to be deist. Can you comment on these labels and identities? Not that I expect any one of you to be a scholar on Jefferson. Although if someone would like to tell the story of Jefferson's Bible.
I'll just confirm that's true. I mean, Thomas Jefferson was, baptized Anglican, raised Anglican, and later in his adult life, really shifted away from some of those views. But yeah, there's entire religious professionals who have devoted their lives to his views, and I am not one of them. So.
Yeah. So Jefferson very famously took 2 copies of a Bible and a razor blade, and he carved all of the miraculous stories from the Gospels out, and then took these and glued the pages together so that he had one book that was freed of any hint of sort of supernaturalism. And the way that he described it was, he said that he was freeing the morals of Jesus as if pulling diamonds out of a dunghill. So he was a deist. He was not a believer in Jesus' divinity in any sense. And the Bible that he had is evidence of that. But also, his identity as a deist at that moment, at that place in history, certainly influenced his beliefs about freedom of religion, right? So like the separation of church and state is a phrase that does not appear in any official document. It comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association, which has been picked up as a metaphor because of who Jefferson is in the founding of the country, and as a way to describe the way that he and so many of his contemporaries approach this issue.
Elise, you wanted to?
This is a little bit going back to the previous question, but I served as a chaplain in the United States Army for a while, which is kind of a real weird quirk, right? It's like the one taxpayer-funded clergy position in our government. So I spent a lot, or one of a few, there's federal prison, there's a few other federally funded ministries. But as a result of that, I spent a lot of time thinking about, like, what am I actually doing? And a lot of time thinking about, like, the First Amendment, which has two clauses. One is the disestablishment clause. So that is saying we will have no official state religion, right? So that's one thing the founders did. No disestablishment, no official state religion. But then the other is the free exercise of religion clause. And I am a little rusty. I didn't actually prep this. This is going back about a decade for me. But that is guaranteeing your right. So if you want to practice your religion, whatever it is, we will allow that to happen. And so, as an Army chaplain, it got that role gets criticized from all sides. More progressive-leaning folks are saying, well, isn't this a violation of the disestablishment clause that, government dollars are funding a religious ministry or a religious professional? And then, more from the conservative side, it's saying, well, how can you serve all different kinds of people? Aren't you sacrificing, whatever your Christian faith is or whatever your denomination is by ministering to all these different kinds of people? And for me, how I understood it was that I am there, my taxpayer-funded job was to guarantee the free exercise of religion. So I spent a lot of time tracking down kosher MREs so my Jewish soldiers could eat. I spent a lot of time finding a room for Muslim soldiers to pray. And that was what my constitutional job was there to do. However, there are also Episcopal soldiers, and there are also Christian soldiers, and they need access to a pastor. And for whatever we want, like I've now done both local pastor, and that is never going to work, to have a local pastor drive 3 hours to the desert in a Humvee to a set of grid coordinates to find soldiers. Like, you need people. So the idea is the government, by placing soldiers in these remote locations, are removing from them their ability to practice their religion. And so the burden is then on the government to bridge that gap. So the government has made it more difficult for soldiers to practice religion. They need to bridge that gap by employing a person to make that possible. And so part of that role was being an Episcopal priest for Christian soldiers, soldiers who wanted to practice their faith. I don't know if that blurs lines more. I did start by saying my job is to blur lines more. But I think it's important to remember the First Amendment is those two different things. It's a disestablishment clause and a free exercise of religion clause.
Real quick, because I wanted to go to this only because I found my quote from the Jefferson Memorial I took a picture of this summer. I think one thing that you probably heard amongst the four of us is, even though we come from different traditions, there are enough getting to similar goals, right? When we think about the big picture. And so I think sometimes if we labor too long on the idea of, well, this person's deist, it would almost be like saying, well, 16 signers were Presbyterian and 22 were Episcopalian. What does that mean? Were we heading towards... well, whatever. I mean, this is on the Jefferson Memorial. God, who gave us life, we're just going to pass right through it, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Commerce between master and slave is despotism. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free. Establish the law for educating the common people. This is the business of the state to effect and on a general plan. So this is literally on the memorial, and I can sign on to that whether deist or not. And so I think sometimes this is so often the interdenominational squabbles we can get into. And so I don't want to discount the question, but I want to ask, especially in this context, where are we all trying to head? We can't forget that this is also a season of the Enlightenment coming forward, and so by nature we are moving away from the supernatural because we are starting to believe that we can do more, right? And so you want to keep in mind that in part, in that season, well, of course we're going to do that, because now look at all the things we can do. We want to feel like we have that. We're able to control the supernatural now, so it makes sense. So Jefferson was getting something right that I can certainly say, even today I can affirm. Like that quote on the building, I'm 100% on board with.
BJ, I want to give you a chance to answer this question. It's about the 1796 Treaty of Tripoli statement that you put on the timeline. Someone wanted to know what the significance was of adding that to the timeline.
Yeah, so the letter to the Danbury Baptist Association is the one that gets brought up a lot, because that's the line that we learn as kids, is separation of church and state, and it's very easy to sort of swat away because it's not an official document. Jefferson is writing, to a group of Baptists, which I think is telling, as a deist to a Baptist in Virginia. I think it's telling, but it's not an official government document. But I don't know my dates. Hold on a second. Thank you. In 1796, so you know the Marine hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli? This is where that comes from, because there were North African pirates who'd been preying on American ships in the North Atlantic, and they were trying to avoid war. It didn't work. There ended up being war, as you can tell from the Marines hymn. And so they signed this peace treaty between the United States and the Barbary states. And one of the articles of the treaty, which is ratified unanimously by Congress, signed by John Adams, who's president at the time, right? This is very early on in the history of the Republic, is very plainly that the United States is not founded as a Christian religion. Therefore, between us and y'all, I'm paraphrasing here, between us and y'all, religious difference will never be an issue that will break the peace that we are now signing. That's an official government document from the 18th century. It's about as old as you're going to get. It's not a letter to a Baptist association. It's approved by Congress. And so, I don't know that it necessarily proves anything by itself, but it's not supposed to. It is just one more signpost in this history that I think is telling and is important to know about.
There were a couple of questions that came in about our word choice. Like, some of us are priests, some of us are reverends, some of us are bishops in other traditions, and then also tradition versus denomination. I'd welcome whoever asked those questions to come up and ask our clergy. Every tradition has its own word choice and ways in which they define clergy and leadership within a church, and so I'd encourage you to ask that. And these are only four denominations here, that each one of them has a family that has grown out. There's not a Methodist up here, because Methodists are really cousins to the Episcopals, and BJ is related to the Amish and the Mennonites as the Anabaptist, and so there are a lot of traditions not represented up here, but they're in similar families. Sarah, it sounds like did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that the other fun part about it is that Lutherans are very friendly, and we have what's called full communion partnerships with the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians, not the Baptists.
Nobody likes the Baptists. Still today, nobody likes the Baptists, and some of this earned, I'll admit.
Yeah. But it means that, I am an Episcopal priest, and I am a Presbyterian pastor, and I am a Lutheran pastor. And we're also in full communion partnership with the Moravian Church and a couple more that I won't be able to think of. But that's kind of neat in that, and the Episcopalians are working on some different, trying to be more friendly. They're working on it. And so that's something that's kind of neat about our denominations as well, is that even though we do have different words for our clergy and different ways of governing our folks, that that we can kind of exchange clergy in that way, which I think is a really cool thing that it's been happening since, I don't know, the early 80s, but a lot of people don't know about it, and I think it's pretty neat.
So the Episcopal Church is in full communion with the ELCA. The ELCA is in communion with the PCUSA, but we are not in full communion.
We're getting close, though. We're getting close. We're getting close.
Are you with the method? Okay. It's tricky.
So there are a lot of great questions that came in that I'm going to save as follow-ups to how this series can continue in the politics of Jesus. Again, we're only speaking of the Christian tradition. I would love to take this church-state conversation into the synagogues. I obviously would love to take this conversation to many of our African-American pastors here in Jacksonville and talk about their own civic engagement. There's lots of ways in which this conversation can go. Tonight was just kind of a grounding in Protestant Reformation, Protestant history, but know that I'm saving some of these questions for future ideas and topics. I think you all have let us know a lot about your tradition, a lot about how maybe you engage with your congregation. I would encourage you, if you have questions about how our clergy here engage with their congregation over matters that they're voting on, over candidates, over issues, that please come in and ask your questions, because each one of us would have a different way of answering that. Before I invite Elizabeth up, though, to give a closing, I would like to give a round of applause to our clergy. As you can tell, they are all friends. They're ribbing on each other and joking with each other because we love one another and we're on the same team. And I really appreciate you saying yes to this, and I look forward to further conversations and where this conversation and dialogue might go. Remember, before Elizabeth does our closing, there is a reception in the narthex if you'd like to have any refreshments. Also, please, just to lift up our Artists Guild here in Jacksonville, go check out the art that's in the narthex. That is a reflection on language from the book of Genesis, let there be light. Elizabeth.
Thank you, guys. Can we give them one more round of applause? I mean, I really appreciate you each coming and bringing your voice and your perspective and your denomination to the conversation. I also want to give a shout out to our One Jack staff. Rebecca, JC, Jan, Paige, Celicia, so many folks here that are making this evening and all of our programming possible. I want to thank them. I want to thank HAB. Thank you. Hendricks Avenue Baptist and all of the members here that have made this evening possible and opened up your home to us, to welcome us in. And more importantly, thanks to each of you for coming here, for leaning into this conversation, and for signing up and being with us tonight. I think it's important to know, as Rebecca mentioned, that we see this conversation as a starting point. It's not a finish line. And so we'd love for you to keep dialogue going, continue to have conversations like this in your networks with friends and family in your neighborhood and in your home. And we hope that you'll continue to join us both for interfaith dialogues, but also for our civil discourse, community suppers. We are starting our Breaking Bread and Barriers series on September 16th. It's going to be Humanity in the Age of Information. And so we think that that'll be a timely and really important series discussing what it means to be human in the digital age. So please keep a lookout for more ways to engage with us. And if you believe in the power of conversations like this, I hope you'll consider supporting our work so that we can continue to bring discussions like this to community. Your generosity certainly helps us create space for dialogue, understanding, and connection. So follow us on social media if you don't already, or you can find us and sign up for our mailing list. You'll probably be on it if you're here with us tonight. And that's the end of that. So luckily, that was the end of my page anyway. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful evening. Enjoy some refreshments, and feel free to ask me other questions. Thank you, guys.